Today's episode is brought to you by Career Academy and their amazing exclusive offer to the Project Management for the Masses listeners. To obtain PMP, CAPM, and Prince 2 certification training, up to 257 PDUs, earn up to 30 college credits, and have unlimited access to over 1,100 courses on project management, business skills, IT, and cybersecurity for only $29. Visit pmforthemasses.com/academy. And yes, for an annual fee of $29, you get access to all 1,100 courses and more. To learn more, visit pmforthemasses.com/academy.
Project managers, have you ever felt like you should get that promotion or a better job? Start a business, write that book. Have you ever felt you were made for more but didn't know where to start?
Welcome to the PM for the Masses podcast with your host, Caesar Abaid.
Learn from the experts, think outside the box, have a voice, network, and be extraordinary.
PM for the Masses podcast.
Hello and welcome once again. I'm Caesar Abaid, your host, and this show is your weekly reminder that your career matters more than your job and that your life is a project and you are the manager. Whether you work for a company or for yourself, your job stability is really just your ability to land your next gig. So, join me in practicing intentional, planned, and value-adding relevance, starting right now. Well, today's a special episode. In fact, probably one of my favorite interviews ever. From the time I was 8 years old, I've been fascinated with this car, the Delorean. And it's my love for it, for this stainless steel shiny car, I think can be traced to the day when I watched Back to the Future for the first time. I was about 8 years old and I was visiting my uncle in Rio, and it was the first time I was watching a movie on VHS, on a VCR, and he was Back to the Future. And since then, I've learned not only to love the car, but also the fascinating story behind it. I mean, the more you look into it, the more there is to learn. So for today's episode of the Project Management for the Masses podcast, I bring you Barrie Wills, whose 50 plus years of experience in the auto industry includes, among other things, being the Director of Product Development and Supply, and also the CEO of the Delorean Motor Company. Now, one of the first podcast episodes that I ever produced was about the Sydney Opera House. And I chose that project for a reason, because that project stands for a contradiction. When you look at schedules and budgets and timelines and milestones, that project was a failure. But when looking at the legacy and impact on society, it was a resounding success. So you see how it can be looked at as a failure or a success. So the DeLorean is part of this select group of projects, which presents us with this conundrum, if you will. Was it a success or was it a failure? I think it was a success. So when it comes to the DeLorean project, there's nobody who knows more about it than Barrie Wills. And I'm thrilled at this opportunity to ask him a few questions. So it's a bit of a longer interview today because there's so much to this story. So how about we get started?
Special guest coming up next. pmforthemasses.com. pmforthemasses.com.
Barrie Wills has over 50 years of experience in the worldwide automobile industry as a direct employee, interim manager, or consultant with Jaguar Cars, British Leyland Truck and Bus, Reliant Motor Company, DeLorean Motor Cars Limited, Lotus Cars, Lamborghini Automobili, Land Rover, Timor Putra National, the UK Department of Trade and Industry, Indonesia's Ministry of Industry, and the European Union. With DeLorean, Barrie was recruited by founder John Z. DeLorean as Director of Purchasing. He joined the company in mid-October 1978, on the actual day the Earth Movers moved onto the 72-acre site. Barrie created purchasing departments in Belfast and Coventry and led sourcing of all plant and equipment, components, and materials. He oversaw the work of Lotus, who handled development engineering for the DeLorean car, and took on additional material control and parts and service responsibilities in 1980 as Director of Supplies. He was appointed Director of Product Development and Supply in October 1981 and later CEO in 1982. And Barrie is on the line with me today from his home in the UK. Mr. Barrie Wills, how are you?
I'm very well indeed, thank you, Cesar. And you?
This is such an honor to have you on the show. I love the DeLorean. I grew up in the 80s with Back to the Future. And not only that, but in South America, where we really didn't see those cars around. So it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I actually saw one live. But it's always been part of my life. I always loved the car, loved the movies and what it represents. And I'm a part of a group on Facebook in which you belong to. And one day I realized, oh my goodness, this guy was there for the whole thing. So
yeah, more than the whole thing.
More than the whole thing. So I thought, okay, maybe we should talk about this, because this show is about projects, and this project is one of those projects that if you look at the numbers and if you look at the history, it could be listed as a failed project. But if you look at the legacy and what it represents today, I mean, you can't argue that it's not a success. So how about we talk about the DeLorean?
Yeah, let's talk about the success of the DeLorean, because you're absolutely right. And I've been on a little personal crusade since I started to write my book to convince the people of Northern Ireland that weren't around that they have something to be proud about in the DeLorean. Same sort of pride that they have with Titanic in a way. You know, both failures, but both great successes in their own way. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's right. It's curious to know how they see that the whole DeLorean, experience up there in Northern Ireland. But you don't live there, do you?
No, I only lived there for the period of the project, although I was extremely nomadic because having been appointed director of purchasing for the company and being responsible, therefore, for two teams of people, one in Belfast who were responsible for sourcing and purchasing all the capital equipment and tooling and consumables down to notebooks, pens, pencils, toilet rolls in Belfast. I also had a separate team of people midway between Belfast and where the car was being developed at Lotus in the east of England. We positioned a production purchasing department in Coventry in the West Midlands, which was then in the heart of the British motor industry, surrounded by the main supply base. So I had a team of people there, a team of people in Belfast, and of course, regular, weekly as it became, visits to Lotus, and of course, an international supplier base where component manufacturers all over the world, including several major component subsidiaries of General Motors, were supplying us. And of course, Renault in France with the supply of the engine and the transmission, the two transmissions. So I led a very nomadic life, and I wish in those days I'd had air miles, because I could have benefited greatly by that.
That's wonderful. So, and you have worked in this industry for over 50 years, and including companies like Jaguar and Reliant. Yep. So, what made the experience at DeLorean special?
Well, I think it was special for several reasons. It was special because of John. I was hired by John.
And just for those who don't know who John is.
Yeah, John Zachary DeLorean, of course, the youngest vice president of General Motors, the guy that was the ideas man behind the Pontiac GTO, somebody I'd read about for several years through the auto magazines and automotive news out of Detroit in particular. You couldn't help but not hear about John DeLorean. And when I read that he'd started his own car manufacturing company, and he eventually came to Northern Ireland, just up the road really from where I was based in England, the fact that I got a phone call to say come and meet the guy was obviously quite exciting. The car itself, of course, with its stainless steel body, its gull-wing doors, its rear engine, its incredibly attractive Giugiaro design was also an attraction. And although it wasn't the first greenfield site project that I'd been involved with, it was probably the most complex, in as much that the plant was to be based right in the heartland in West Belfast of a near war zone where the Troubles, as the Irish refer to them, were at their height really at that time. The opportunity to work with Lotus again, who were friends of mine, who in fact had been trying to hire me for a period of months prior to being introduced to John. People I knew, people I liked, and the opportunity to work with them was attractive too. So there was a whole package of things, but I think above all it was the charisma and charm of John Delorean that in the end encouraged me to join the company.
Mm-hmm. I when I think about this, I picture an NFL football, an American football coach coming over to coach an English football team. So how was was there a cultural shock? John Delorean coming from Detroit, basically, where they built things like the GTO and the Cadillac Fleetwood.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there was a shock for some people. There wasn't a shock for most of my colleagues because I was really one of only two senior guys that was recruited from the British industry. The rest came out of Chrysler and GM. I don't think we had a senior guy from Ford, but they were well versed with the Detroit mentality. I had been exposed to it because I'd been, as a purchasing guy, Jaguar and later at Little Reliant Motor Company, I'd been used to doing business with companies like Borg Warner and Ford Motor Company in particular, purchasing engines from them in the past. And we'd also at Reliant had a very, very strong relationship with the Budd Company, the pioneers of sheet molded compound, the tooling method of producing fiberglass panels that has been exploited around the world very well. And we had exchanges not only with Budd, but also with the Corvette plant in America, where the Corvette was the highest volume car produced out of, to use the old term, fiberglass composites, as we now call it. And Reliant was the largest in Europe, believe it or not. We were building about 20,000 vehicles a year, both in the UK and in Turkey. So there was an exchange, regular exchange visits with them. So I was pretty well exposed to the American scene myself. So I felt reasonably comfortable.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So how I see you mentioned Lotus. I'm somewhat familiar with the story because I've read a lot about it because I'm a fan of the car. But correct me if I'm wrong. So the engine was supplied by Renault. The chassis was developed by Lotus. The design was Italian, and then you have this American guy leading a project in Northern Ireland. Is this correct?
That's right. Yes. I ought to just to correct one thing. The engine was supplied by Renault, but it was a joint development between Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo. It was a very European engine. It was manufactured in France. It was called the PRV engine, a V6, 2.85 litre. And then the transmissions were both of Renault design and supply. So yes, it's another example of how international the project was.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at some of the prototypes of the car, and I think some of them were built, I think maybe 2 or 3 of them, they look a little bit different than the actual production car. So what was some of the non-negotiables when it came to the requirements for this project? Because I know some things had to be changed, but was it the stainless steel? Was it the gull wings? What are some of the things that John said, we cannot compromise on these requirements?
Yeah, John had 3 firm product plans that were totally non-negotiable. One was a stainless steel body skin, stainless steel body skin. The second was gull wing doors, and the third was a rear-mounted engine. just like the Porsche 911, if you like. Right. Those are the three firm things. What we had to remember when the project got off the ground towards the end of 1978 was something that Giugiaro told us straight away, that the car design had been around since 1974-5. It was getting on for 4 to 5 years old, and in normal terms, had the car been launched in 1974-5, it would by then have had a freshening, a facelift, want of a better term. Right. So Giugiaro immediately requested that he should have another attempt at it. When he designed the car originally, it was during an era where sharp edges were very much the theme of things. By 78, 79, we were smoothing cars out. So the first change he made to the car was to get rid of the creases in the body style and replace them by curves. He freshened the front and rear ends of the car, and he changed the belt line of the car. It had the original prototype that were built in the USA before the project moved to Northern Ireland, had a sort of break line between the door glass and the rear quarter glass. Giugiaro smoothed that out and made it a continuous line through the car. A total redesign of the interior. New seats, new instrument panel, new center console, new fascia, a complete and door casings, a complete change to the interior from scratch.
Yeah, that's
and then new wheels. He designed a very nice, difficult to manufacture, but with the help of one of the subsidiaries of GKN in the UK, who made the alloy wheels, compromises were reached, which still resulted in a very attractive road wheel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that's striking, the difference in the interior. You look at the prototypes; it looks very much 1970s, but what actually ended up being produced, it looks very much like late 80s, early 90s. I mean, very contemporary, and still it doesn't look and feel like an old car on the inside.
Yeah, it still holds up, doesn't it? It's quite surprising. Yeah. One of the things we did, Cesar, when we kicked off the program with Lotus, we were very conscious of the fact that Lotus, as much as we respected them, had never really engineered a car for medium volume. John's plans were for 20 to 30,000 a year. Lotus then were building cars really in hundreds. So we bought two cars as reference points. One was a Porsche 928, which was hot off the shelves then.
Front engine, right?
But front engine, but we were looking more at body engineering and body design and the type of componentry to be used at volume. More than anything else. So we used that as a reference for the Lotus engineers to take note of. And the second car was a Ferrari. We bought a Ferrari, and they then again had the ability to refer to that. So that, I think, was a great aid to the Lotus body engineers in completing what turned out to be a very, very up-to-date interior that reflected Giugiaro's renderings that he gave us to the Ultimate.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that the rear tires are different size in the front. Is that related to the fact that the car is the engine's in the back and you need a little bit more grip there on curves?
Yeah. There was a big weight difference between the front and the rear of the car, with the engine and transmission being basically behind the wheels. So it did need a larger tire at the rear to the one at the front. And of course, wheels accordingly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was reading and watching some of the reviews for the car from the early 80s, including a Motor Week piece that they did. And they were really, I think most of the reviews were, they're really impressed with the looks of the car and handling. but the engine nobody was a big fan of. How did that engine end up being chosen, and why?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, John Delorean's passed away 10 years ago, so I can't ask him. It was the only contract that I inherited. The only done deal that I inherited in terms of componentry to the car. The negotiation and the contracts with Renault preceded me by, I think, about 2 to 3 years. So it was, to be quite frank, the PRV engine was not the best performer of all. Strategically, it was probably one of the few engines that were available to us. We realistically were not going to be buying engines from one of the big three. The Japanese, but at that time, had not really ventured internationally with their engines. We did look at a Mitsubishi V6 when I was renegotiating the deal with Renault, because it was made clear to me that by Gene Cafiro, who was John Delorean's number 2 as president of the company, that unfortunately the price negotiation that had been completed originally was really not good. The cost of the powertrain was too high. So for the first time ever in my career, I had to go and renegotiate a contract that had been signed by my chairman. I think really to a great extent it was a case of being very, very few engines in terms of a V engine rather than a straight engine, an inline engine that was available on the market at the time that could meet the federal and Californian emission standards. So we started off with an engine that was not the best performer, for sure. But we then had the task of ensuring that powertrain met Californian emission regulations. We went for the stricter standard of California because we felt at relatively low volumes we wanted the flexibility. We didn't want to be building 2 engine specs, one for California and one for the rest of America. So we went for the Californian most difficult standard. We achieved it, but in so doing, we met the penalty that really all car manufacturers that were selling into the US at that time were faced with, and that was the emission equipment and catalytic converters and everything else that was involved, lambda, SONS, and the rest of it, were all in their infancy, and they all resulted in lowering the power output of the engine in question. Now, then you're faced with the world and his dog wanting to drive this very attractive, unique automobile with a stainless steel body and gull-wing doors as soon as they could get their hands on it. Many of the journalists that got their hands on cars were not used to driving American cars that had the emission equipment of that era. And therefore, in their minds, they were comparing the performance of the DeLorean with European cars, Porsches, and Lotuses and the rest of them, which were unencumbered by the emissions equipment. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons why we had a tough press in terms of the performance of the powertrain.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that the Porsche 911 was kind of a comparison point. Most of these articles, I think, because the price point was similar and rear engine, and they seem to compare it to the Porsche a lot, but when it came to the performance, it was not. It wasn't even close in terms of horsepower and things like that, right?
Yeah, a totally different category of car, really. The DeLorean shouldn't really be regarded as a sports car. It's more of a grand touring car. It's more of a boulevard cruiser. It's not an out-and-out sports car in the manner of a Porsche 911 or a Lotus Esprit or the equivalent.
Mm-hmm. So But tell us a little bit about the launch and how that was like to see these reviews coming in and users excited about it and magazine articles and things like that.
Well, the launch was remarkable. Firstly, whereas we had a poor press in the UK, we suffered very badly from, I think, a self-imposed problem that we didn't really have PR people representing us in the UK of really the experience that we needed. We didn't expect to be having to cope with a critical British press. In the US, the position was entirely different. The American philosophy, it was closer to the sort of maverick style of management and approach that was reflected by John Delorean. They admired the pioneering spirit of the company, and the press we got in America was 180 degrees opposed to the critical press we had in the UK. So at the time of the launch, everything was looking good. We'd had a group of the leading American journalists, automotive journalists, over in Northern Ireland, driving the cars around the test track on the factory site and around the glens and beautiful coastline of Northern Ireland. Virtually every one of the major automotive magazines in the USA gave us very, very good reports initially. And so by the time we came to the major international launch, which was at Geneva around now, end of February of 1981, the scene was set for what turned out to be a quite remarkable occasion. And I can remember, and I've written about this in the book, that on the first of the two press days, we'd had a little party of our own around just after breakfast time, where we'd launched the car. John had made his speech and everything else, but that was to a relatively small group of journalists. When it came to the show being opened by a local Geneva dignitary, the hall was packed with journalists and photographers over just about every stand in what is quite a large exhibition hall. Suddenly there was a buzz around the place, and there was a rush towards the main door where John and his beautiful wife, Christina Ferrari, who was then, of course, pretty well the leading fashion model in the USA, had appeared in the doorway, and the whole press contingent, the whole paparazzi, surrounded them at the door as they entered the hall. Quite remarkable. It's a scene I've never seen repeated. As I say in the book, it was like Princess Charles and Princess Diana arriving. so much was the interest.
That's amazing. That must have been really an exciting day for everybody involved.
It was unrepeatable. I've never experienced anything quite like it in my life before, and it was absolutely remarkable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the final couple of years, I guess, people can search on Wikipedia and online, and they'll find all sorts of reports on how this thing unraveled. But you were there. I mean, you were there from the beginning when they started to break ground, and you were there at the end when you handed over the keys to the auctioneer, as you put it. What happened, and what has the press and gotten wrong about the story that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, one of the things I set out to do with the book was to correct the many myths, and in some cases downright lies that have been spread over the years about the project. They sort of grew like topsy over the 3 or 4 years after the company closed, as various people attempted to write the history, not very accurately, I'm afraid. The problem started in the summer of 1981 when we were about 4 to 5 months into production. production had risen to around 40 cars a day, quite successfully. We'd had our teething problems at the start, and we'd had to establish quality assurance centres at the ports of entry in the USA to basically, they'd have been there anyway to do the normal things like fit local components, but license plate covers on the cars and that sort of thing, toolkits and the like. But we did use those facilities to carry out full checks on the cars, and where there were faults, where there was poor assembly, where there were features that needed upgrading, those were carried out there. But by June, July of that year, production has settled quite nicely at 40 cars a day, a single shift in assembly, 2 shifts in terms of the composite body production. That was because the Lotus vacuum-assisted resin injection system that had been adopted was very difficult to productionize even for our volumes. Lotus had been used to using it in, as I said, hundreds of units per annum. We were really turning it into a volume process, and we did that quite successfully. But it required 2 shifts to meet the volumes that we were building. The demand from the US market was, it was over the top. Dick Brown, who was our vice president of sales and marketing based in California, was inundated with orders from dealers under immense pressure. John Delorean was also under pressure. He was under pressure from the Conservative government in the UK that had come to power in 1979, who had inherited the project from their Socialist Labour Party predecessors. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, the arch privateer, the lady who was less favourable of public intervention in private industry than probably anybody around at that time. She was not a fan of the project. She did not like public money being spent on what he perhaps considered to be a frivolous exercise by a flash American in Northern Ireland. However, the agreement that had been reached with the government when the funding was provided back in the summer of 78 almost had a wish list within it of privatization. Float the company. Let the government get out. The politicians had John under immense pressure to do just that by the time the project was up and running properly. He saw the opportunity with the market demand behind the car to go for a public offering on the New York Stock Exchange to be carried out later in 1981. Now, couple that with the size of the demand, John decided, supported by the shareholders, supported by the board of directors, which included, of course, government representatives, he decided that we should increase production from the 40 a day to 80 a day. That required a lot more labor and an extra shift, a night shift, and a third shift in body production. To achieve that, we had to have a very rapid recruitment process and a training process. That did 2 things. One, it achieved the lift to 80 a day, but it did it in a manner that, again, led to a repeat of some of the teething problems at the very beginning of lower quality. Those were recoverable, which occurred. The quality assurance centres in the USA came to the party again, and those difficulties were overcome. However, by the winter of that year, when we're now producing at 80 a day, the economy moved into one of the most rapid, deepest slides in U.S. history since the Great Depression. It was very quick, it was very sudden, and it was very severe. Secondly, America found itself in the worst weather it had experienced in modern history. The winter of 81, 82 was extremely severe. People stopped buying anything, never mind cars. We were in shared dealerships. There were no dealerships in the USA, and I think there was something like 350 of them at the time that were soulless to Delorean. They were all shared with a major car manufacturer, from Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, through some of the Europeans. When it came to the crunch, the dealers wanted to move, or needed to move, the volume cars that they had to sell. The 2 or 3 DeLoreans could be shoved to one side whilst they concentrated on selling the 100 or so Buicks, or the 100 or so Cadillacs or Chryslers or whatever. We had a credit line with Bank of America that was more than satisfactory to cover a normal situation. But when we were faced with a position where we'd been shipping cars out to America at the rate of 400 a week, and suddenly the other end of the supply chain, cars out of dealerships, dwindled down to a fraction of that. The pipeline filled up, the credit line dried up, and we were strapped for cash. And we basically didn't quite run out of money. We had nearly $2 million in the bank, but that $2 million had to be measured against a much larger bill in terms of paying suppliers mainly suppliers and services, and the labor force. So we basically entered the equivalent of Chapter 11, what was called receivership in the UK at that time, as a means of trying to keep the company alive. What happened then was that we found ourselves in a position where we were working for a new boss. The government of the time, with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, James Pryor, who was a member of the British Cabinet, appointing a receiver, or a pair of receivers. But effectively, the most senior man was Sir Kenneth Cork, who was without doubt at that time the most famous of the practitioners in bankruptcy in the UK. The British press had given him the nickname The Undertaker, because he'd had 2 very, very high profile bankruptcies to handle, neither of which was he able to resolve. It finished up in those companies going into liquidation. The press coverage and the media coverage was immense about that. That's where the term The Undertaker came from. He'd had his successes, and in fact he'd had an automotive industry success only a matter of months before he was handed DeLorean, and there's no doubt that it was that success that led to James Pryor selecting him to be the man to come to the salvation of DeLorean Motor Cars Limited. And that was a truck manufacturer in the UK, a long-established one called Foden, who had gone into receivership. They were bought out of receivership by PACCAR, the American corporation, who later purchased DAF trucks, amongst others. And that was a great success. It meant that the banks were paid off. Most of the creditors, if not all the creditors, got a small dividend, relatively small, but reasonable dividend against their debts. And Foden was re-established and is still there to this day, making specialist trucks within the PACCAR group. So Kenneth Cork and his partner Paul Schul came on the scene with their small team of executives out of the Cork Gully, as it was called, practice, which was a subsidiary of Coopers and Lybrand, now PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And we found ourselves in a totally new regime, one where we couldn't pay any of the debts that were outstanding to any of the suppliers. Cork decided very constructively to continue production, albeit at a very limited scale. We did some homework to establish that there was about 500 car sets of half-finished or part-finished cars and components in the pipeline that, of course, could create cash for the receivership. He could sell those cars, and so the decision was made to utilize some of the labor force to purchase a few more parts for cash. You know, you couldn't go out and take on more credit. Anything you bought had to be paid for by cash to suppliers, and all our suppliers were very, very cooperative. There was immense support from the whole supplier body throughout the whole project, and particularly during the difficulties of the receivership. And so life went on in a strange manner. No sign of John, of course. John never came back to Northern Ireland at that time at all. Don Lander, who'd been my managing director, the Canadian who came out of Chrysler to join us, moved over to the USA because the American end was beginning to fall apart. Dealers were beginning to lose heart. There was a major need for someone to hold together the dealer network so that when and if the company was reestablished, it had still got that ability to retail and service cars in the American market. So Don relocated over to California and left me behind as de facto third and final, as it turned out, managing director, CEO of the Belfast operation. So I then found myself in a position where, having formerly been purchasing director, supplies director, short period of time as product development and supply director, I was now really running what was left of the company for the receiver. So that was a very unique experience, and one that, frankly, I learned a lot from. I learned a lot from Sir Kenneth Cork and his partner Paul Schul. And it's a case of, when you're in a mess like that, you might as well make the best of it and learn from the process.
Correct. Yeah. And would you say that, there was little bit of a scandal back in the U.S., I guess, with John Delorean, that eventually he got cleared up and there was no wrongdoing, apparently. But do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, the famous gold taps scandal. I mean, extraordinary. I need to be careful in what I say, but there was the odd person within the US operation that I think had scores to settle with John. There were fallouts. There were destructions of relationships. I think if you ever offended John Delorean in a major way, then he was not a man to take lightly. And there was one particular individual, I think, went out of his way to leak things to the press, and particularly through a third party secretary out of the New York office, leak things to the UK press and a member of Parliament in the UK who had an axe to grind too, which led to a short, swift flurry of very, very bad publicity, certainly in the UK, around the world to some extent, about misuse of company funds, gold taps in a company house, which in fact was little more than a one-bedroomed apartment at the time, that was occupied by the chief executive. And, for a period of time, I was the guardian of the so-called gold taps. It's interesting that when that house and an apartment was refurbished many years later, I think the so-called gold taps went to the scrapyard. They weren't sold off for, lots of money. They were scrapped. So that was a huge distraction. It caused a furore in Parliament. It led to a police inquiry. The police came into the company and after about 2 weeks declared that there was nothing for them to be investigating. So, that's just one of the side issues that we had to contend with. And of course, we also, things were disrupted later that year when you may remember the hunger strikes that went on in the Maze, H Block as it was called, the prison where the IRA prisoners were kept. A group of them, up to about a dozen, I think, decided that they were going on hunger strike, and eventually it came to the crunch where the first one of them, who had actually stood for Parliament in a by-election and had been elected an MP in the UK Parliament in Westminster, never attended because he was in jail. Bobby Sands died. And the night that he died, his body was taken home to his mother, who lived in a housing estate across the fence from the plant. It was the closest, they were the closest domestic buildings to the plant. A riot started. The police and the army moved onto the housing estate to quell the riot. They drove the rioters, unfortunately, towards the plant. In so doing, the rioters broke through the perimeter fence. We had two fences in those days, about 100 yards or more apart. They broke through the perimeter fence to the next fence, where it was very easy to throw some Molotov cocktails across the fence onto the roof of a series of temporary buildings that were the sort of things you see on major construction sites these days, where they'll build a whole series of offices that look pretty basic from the outside, but inside they can look pretty good, look like a very nice open plan office, housed about up to about 100 people, with records that went back to the start of the business, October 1978. They were burnt to the ground. Records were lost. Every personnel record we had that time something like 1,300 employees. The records of all those employees disappeared overnight. Every employee had to be interviewed again. The whole personnel record had to be reestablished. Every production drawing was lost. Every engineering drawing was lost. Fortunately, we had copies in different other places, and computer systems were lost. It was a diabolical night. The following morning, I can remember now. I can see it in my mind's eye. The sight of employees dressed in overalls, picking their way through burnt, charred filing cabinets, trying to find records, trying to salvage what they could. And I saw grown men cry that morning,
Wow.
Guys that had, worked from early days, local people, worked from the early days, who, as far as they were concerned, the work that they'd done over the previous 2 years had been destroyed. We pulled around. It took us a long time to pull around. We lost production through it. Disruption continued. We had the British Army had to move on to the site because the firebombing continued over several days and nights. And it's the first time in my life, and I hope the only one, where I'd been working with a young soldier in my office with a gun sticking out of the window, protecting me. And his commanding officer coming into my office prior to that and suggesting I might like to move my desk so that I'm not sitting with my back to the window. Exciting times,
The more I learn about the whole story of this car, just the more colorful the story is. It's amazing.
Well, you couldn't make it up, Cesar. I've said this many times. If I wrote the book I've written as fiction, people would say, come on, that's ridiculous. That no way can all that have occurred, you know?
Mm-hmm.
There are a series of sort of sub-headlines that you can write, you know. Unfortunately, with something we haven't talked about, the project got off the ground with none of us knowing there was an embezzlement of investors' funds going on through the famous GPD, or infamous, I should say, GPD contract, the contract that brought Lotus into the program. You know, there was a record 28 months, never been achieved before, and certainly will never be achieved afterwards, from getting a car from basically nothing, from Giugiaro's drawings and a prototype demonstrator that, as you said earlier, was to an old design anyway, getting that vehicle from that state to production and sale in 28 months. You know, I've mentioned the Troubles, the firebombing, the British Army occupation, running out of money, receivers appointed. Oh, and then we haven't talked about either that during the receivership, the hourly paid labour force, the guys on the shop floor, decided to stage a sit-in and locked out the staff of the company, allowed me in as the then chief executive, and my secretary and the receiver's representative was allowed in. It's a good job because he effectively owned the plant anyway. But, you know, that was a sign of the commitment of the labour force. It wasn't particularly helpful, actually, but it was an indication of how committed they were to keeping the company alive. During that sit-in, we developed a European version of the car, which we got within one test of achieving European homologation, the process through which you go to ensure that a car meets the legislation of the markets in Europe. We did that whilst locked out, having taken over a former empty typewriter factory in another part of Belfast, housing about 100 people, equipping them with drawing boards, with vehicle lifts, with desks, phones, basically overnight. You know, all that we did in our spare time. You know, and then you got onto the rescue bids and other things. You know, you haven't very kindly mentioned the FBI's cocaine sting, which led to John Delorean's arrest. And, of course, then, unfortunately, the liquidation and closure. Now, all that happened in 4.5 years.
Mm-hmm. And I'll let, I was waiting for you to bring that up because I'm not sure how comfortable you are talking about that, but I think...
I'm comfortable talking about anything, don't worry, because I over the last 35 years, I've been attacked by just about everyone.
So there was some investigation by the FBI and he was eventually cleared, correct?
Well, he was set up by the FBI.
Oh, okay.
It's clear that the FBI had got their sights on a cocaine importing operation out of Colombia, your neck of the woods.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
And they needed someone who desperately needed money to provide them with the way in. And John fitted that profile perfectly. So an FBI officer, an FBI, I'm going to start again, safer on that one.
No problem.
An FBI agent posing as a bank official agreed to provide John with loans through which to salvage the company out of receivership. We were so fooled, everybody was so fooled by that fabrication that the receiver, Sir Kenneth Court, I can remember on one occasion, asked me to ring this bank in Southern California to provide some information. I think it was about numbers of cars we had left in stock or something along those lines. And I had a conversation with this banker. I provided him with the information he wanted, and we finished the phone call, and that was it. Only after John Delorean was arrested did I find out that the guy I'd been speaking to over the telephone was an FBI agent. Such was the complexity of the sting operation. John was arrested in a Los Angeles hotel room, and that was the end of the company in Northern Ireland. It was interesting that the night before, or the evening before, at around 5 o'clock, I received a phone call from the receivers telling me that, sorry, Barry, but tomorrow morning it's all over. We want you to pull the labour force together and tell them the sad news that the company is going into liquidation. There is no time left. And I'm saying, wait a minute, we spent all day as a team of what was the people that were left planning restart of production, planning for John, having raised the money, to take the company back. What on earth is going on? Sorry, Barry, came the answer. We can't tell you. Just do the job you're being paid to do what we're asking, call the labour force together, close the company down. I went to bed that night, as I said in the book, counting gold taps to try and go to sleep. My alarm went off at 6:30, a radio alarm the following morning. The BBC radio news comes on. The first item is that the car magnate, John Delorean, had been arrested for trading in cocaine in a hotel room in Southern California, That was how I found out what the reason was for the company closure. I don't think I've ever woken up as quickly as I woke up that morning. I then had to go into the plant. Firstly, call the representatives together of the shop floor labour, tell them the bad news, which they'd already heard, of course, over the radio or television that morning. Disbelief all round, shock, bewilderment, all amazingly gracefully received. Nobody protested. It was just a realization that this was the end. I then had to repeat the process with the staff, tell them the bad news, and then basically plan for closing shop, getting ready for the inevitable auction of plant and equipment, almost new plant and equipment that we'd worked so hard to negotiate contracts for and install in the plant and prove out, implement, produce the cars from, to the point where from October to February of 1983, we did little other than close shop, tidy up, and as you said earlier, hand over the keys of the plant to the auctioneers for them to sell the equipment off.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. It just when you think the story covered all every possible weird aspect. Then bringing in an FBI sting operation and cocaine to top it all. Okay.
And every emotion, from the wonderful experience of the launch in the spring of 1981 in Geneva, to the disappointment of the receivership caused by the company's inability to meet its commitments financially, and then of course the despair almost of the closure.
Mm-hmm. And in a short span of time as well, and not only that, you especially towards the end, you had such a big responsibility. I can only imagine what it must have been like to go to bed that night, knowing that you'd have to, in the morning, provide leadership to that group and not being able to give them an answer of why. Luckily, there was a BBC report that you could point them to, but man, that's really tough.
Yeah, it wasn't wasn't the situation I'd look forward to in my life. But as I said earlier, you're faced with these demands upon you, and you've just got to make the best of it and make the best of the opportunity, and I guess show the leadership, and of course then wind people back up again, because there was a nucleus then of about, I don't know, 150 so employees that were kept on to complete the receivership. We'd still got a few cars to finish off, to build and to sell, to again bring in much needed funds to pay our salaries and wages. This money didn't come from nowhere. It came from what the receiver had got in his bank account, and therefore what we could sell off to keep that bank account in place enabled us to get paid.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I mean, not very good, but that is as good as it gets. And the fact that you could still sell the car. I mean, the product was good. That's that. I think in the end, that is something to be proud of. And it's people still want the car, and which takes me to the last thing I'd like to talk about today. Very quickly. Talk about Back to the Future. What was that like to have the spotlight on the brand again after maybe 3 years after you handed off the keys? I'm sure that was exciting.
Yeah, well, the first feeling was one of why the hell couldn't that have happened whilst we were still in production? Because you can't, car manufacturers are spending millions on getting their products placed in movies these days. Yeah, there's one guy who was one of the Lotus engineers that worked on the project from about 1979 through to 1981, and was one of the small team of Lotus people that came across to assist the manufacturing launch, that is now product placement manager at Chrysler. And he spends half his life in Hollywood trying to arrange for Chrysler cars to appear in movies. This all happened, unfortunately, 2 years too late for us. But yeah, it was an astonishing feeling. I remember taking my 2 young daughters, who were early teenagers then, to see the movie that night, and not quite knowing what on earth I was going to see. I'm not even sure that I knew the DeLorean featured in it, if I'm really honest, because I was pretty busy re-establishing my career at that time. I wasn't necessarily reading movie reviews, but it was a film they wanted to see. We went to see it, and they were thrilled to bits by it. I was astonished and delighted by it, to the point where I remember I'd got an Audi 100, the aerodynamic Audi 100 that came out in the mid-'80s at that time. It was brand new, and I can remember driving it, much to their screams of delight, at 88 miles an hour on the way home.
That's the hatchback one, yeah? That
No, it wasn't a hatchback. No,
okay.
It was a boring saloon, full of black and grey trim, very Germanic,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Scotty, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say the DeLorean is probably one of the there's Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd and the DeLorean. I mean, that's the triad of stars in that movie. And you talk about the fact that car companies try to get their cars into movies, and I know that Ford wanted Doc Brown to drive a Mustang, and they offered money to Bob Gale.
Yes.
And they thought about saying, no way, there's no way that.
Well, there's a quote that I'm not going to repeat, but Bob Gale apparently said, "There's no way Doc Brown would drive a Mustang."
Well, especially a 1985 Mustang,
Yes, exactly. They were a greater dog than the DeLorean.
Oh goodness, those are ugly things. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. And just to wrap up, now there's I know that there's a company in Texas who bought the surplus parts.
Yep.
And basically bought the whatever was left, and they've been supplying parts to collectors and people who have DeLoreans. And there is a rumor just in the last few weeks that they're gonna produce the car again. What is that all about?
Yeah, it's true. There's a change of legislation in the USA, a bill that was signed off just before Christmas last year, that allows for the first time what is called replica car production to be undertaken in the USA without the manufacturer of such cars having to meet all the regulations that are imposed upon volume car manufacturers. Now, what they have to do is to meet current emissions regulations. So the dear old PRV engine, Peugeot, Renault, Volvo engine that was used in the production DeLorean ain't going to do. There's got to be a new engine for it. But it is designed to allow companies like DeLorean Motor Company in Houston, Texas, to set about low-volume car manufacture. Now, I'm not going to deny the fact that they've been in touch. Stephen Wynn, who is the owner and president of DeLorean in Houston, has become a very good friend over the years, and we've met on several occasions now. I visited Houston several years ago. I've seen the facility, which is absolutely first rate, and the work they do is marvelous. And every DeLorean owner, all 6,500 of them across the world, from North America to New Zealand and Japan, New Zealand. It's quite astonishing where the cars have now spread to. Really ought to be very grateful for the phenomenal job those people do. So they're going to take advantage of the opportunity, and very roughly they have about 500 car sets of parts left in stock in Houston. That sounds a lot, but when you're building cars at the rate of 80 a day and you suddenly stop production, and you're in Northern Ireland with no local suppliers, your nearest local suppliers in England, you finish up with a lot in the pipeline, a lot of components in transit, and all those were brought together and sold off and eventually ended up in the hands of Stephen Wynn's team in Houston. So they're going to take advantage of that. Of the 500, they're going to utilize 300 car sets of parts. There are a few missing parts that can be handled. There are means of reproducing those not from the original tooling, because that's all gone, but there are ways and means of producing those components in low volume. 300 cars over about a 5-year period. So, it's not exactly mass production. It's not what John DeLorean envisaged, but it does mean that there will be 2017 model year DeLoreans appearing, which makes me very happy because, it means that, to a degree, the job's going to be finished. The job that we had to abandon on the 19th of October 1982, the day of John's arrest, people can finish off.
Barrie, this has been a pleasure. I went over my typical time here on purpose because I wanted to get the whole story, and what a story that is. Thank you so much. If people want to learn more about you, about the DeLorean, and how to get your book, where should they go?
Well, the book is called John Z, The DeLorean and Me. It's available online through the publishers at www.deloreangarage.com. It's also available on the usual Amazon, eBay routes as well. US dollars $39.99 plus packaging and post.
Okay.
It's full of pictures. If you don't like reading the words, there's plenty of pictures to look at.
Okay, and I'll add links to that on the show notes for today's episode. And I have to say, this is probably my favorite interview of all time, and I've done hundreds of them. So thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating and delightful.
Cesar, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I've enjoyed it immensely.
You are listening to the PM for the Masses podcast.
Wow. This was amazing. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. I don't know, maybe I'm just a fanatic of the car, and this is really extremely interesting to me because I like the car so much. But I don't know, man. This story is just so incredible. It's just so full of twists and turns, and the background, the political background. And I mean, if you grew up in the 80s, you remember some of these things that Barrie talked about, with Margaret Thatcher and in Northern Ireland and all these things. It's incredible. And when I invited Barrie to come onto the show and be a guest, I knew it was going to be interesting, but I did not know it was going to be this interesting. So Barrie, thank you so much again for being a part of this episode, which so far I think stands as one of my favorite episodes of the show that I've ever done. So take a look at the show notes for today's episode over at pmforthemasses.com. Now, before I go today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my book and also the sponsor for today's show. About my book, you can still get Project Management for You, the book that I wrote, in audio format at no cost to you if you buy the Kindle version of the book on Amazon. And all you have to do is go to projectmanagementforyou.com and follow the steps there. The book right now is listed at $4.99 on Amazon. And if you buy there, send me the receipt. I'll send you the audiobook for free. Again, you go to projectmanagementforyou.com for more information. And also, let's talk about Career Academy and the amazing offer that they have made for us here at the PM for the Masses community. So today's episode is sponsored by Career Academy and this offer. This offer is called the Certified Learner Membership through Career Academy. And for $29 annually, so I've been talking about the $29 cost. It gets you access to all these things, all these courses for a whole year. Okay? And with this membership, members get free unlimited access to over 1,100 IT, cybersecurity, project management, and business skills video courses. It's literally hundreds of hours in training. This includes over 600 project management courses, including training for the PMP, the PMI ACP, the CAPM, and the PMI Risk Management Professional certifications. You have the ability to earn up to 257 PDUs or contact hours because Career Academy is a PMI REP recognized. So you get credit and you get PDUs for all these courses that you take. This training is on-demand training, so you can access it at any time, 24/7. Besides the training and the video training, you get access to over 10,000 review questions, so you can test your knowledge after you take the courses. You also get certificates of completion that provides proof of successful completion, of course, and this is issued from both Career Academy and the American Business and Technology University. So you get a university certification for these courses that you take. The videos are available on your computer, on your tablet, or on your smartphone, and you get priority customer support. So if you have any issues watching the video or downloading the questions, you have priority customer support. About project management, what kind of project management training do you get with this package? So you get introduction to project management, you get training on the CAPM, which is a certified associate in project management. You get PMP training, you get Agile Certified Practitioner, the ACP. You learn about risk management, the Risk Management Professional certification, Quality Management, Risk Management Professional, Scrum Immersion, Quality Management, and on and on and on. There's a lot of material here for just $29 per year. And the way to access all this, of course, you can always go to pmforthemasses.com and look up the show notes for this episode to find the link. But you can always go to pmforthemasses.com/academy. Again, pmforthemasses.com/academy, and you're going to see our logo there and the offer that was custom made for us. And I really hope you take advantage of this year. If passing one of these certification exams is one of your goals for 2016, this is the way to go. And this is what I had for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I did. This is one of the reasons why I do this show, is because I enjoy it so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode in which we talk about the Delorean. And take advantage of the opportunity to get my book, my audiobook, for free by going to projectmanagementforyou.com. And don't forget to visit Career Academy's page at pmforthemasses.com/academy. And that's all I had for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I talk to you again next time. And until then, my friends, remember that life is a project and you are the manager. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you for listening to the PM for the Masses podcast.
Tune in next week for more great ideas on how to manage your projects better and truly stand out in your industry.
pmforthemasses.com